I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. When discussing this film, I will end up discussing sexual violence, homophobia, and misogyny. If you are affected by any of those things and feel like it would negatively impact you listening to this episode, I won't blame you if you give this one a skip. Take care of yourselves. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is, at least when I'm recording this, officially time to start celebrating Halloween, and for that reason, I have prepared a specific spooky episode where we're going to end up discussing all kinds of interesting themes regarding horror and women and lesbians. And you're in for a treat because I have quite a bit to say. So, as you may or may not know, for this season of the podcast, so throughout the year, I have been watching international cinema, so mainly non-English language films. And for my pick for this episode, I have picked Vampyros Lesbos. Vampyros Lesbos is a 1971 erotic horror film directed by Jesus Franco, also known as Jess Franco. Existing as a blend of Dracula fanfiction and a Carmilla ripoff, the film follows Linda as her life becomes more entwined with the enigmatic and alluring Countess Nadine Carady. She is sure the Countess is bad news and finds her life more and more upended as she tries to break free of her control. What is one in the many lesbian vampire films, this movie sets itself apart by incorporating a fluid style of storytelling rife with symbolism, if not mostly by accident, as Franco was known to shoot multiple movies at once and construct the stories during the editing process. This is a film where, as was common with Franco's work, the actors are speaking their native languages and they are then dubbed over in German, which was kind of true for a lot of Euro horror of this time. So this film was shot in Turkey, was funded by Germans, and had a Spanish director. Potentially one of the most international films, ? On Rotten Tomatoes, this has a 56% critic score and a 47% audience score. And on Letterboxd, it has a 3.2. However, I found when I was doing research for this episode, especially when I was listening to podcasts of people going over the film and I was reading articles, Jess Franco is a really well-respected director amongst cult horror fans. And as a result, most of the feedback I got about the film was very positive, which is kind of interesting for a man directing a film about queer women in the 70s. There's a lot to unpack, and we are going to, but I did think it was quite interesting that so many people had a lot of respect for the way that he constructed movies and the way that he shot things. So whilst these scores are not the highest of the high, Franco and this film in particular have a very special place in a lot of people's hearts. I think it's worth unpacking why that is and why people may prefer this over other lesbian vampire films. But before we get to that, I'm going to read a couple of reviews from Letterboxd. Now, I am going to be honest. I was trying very hard to find reviews written by women, especially queer women, because I found a lot of the top reviews were written by men. And whilst I love men and I do value their opinions, when it comes to representations of lesbianism, especially very sexualized lesbianism, I tend to defer more to women and what they think of this, which is not to say that there's like a stark gender difference, like this film is mostly loved by men and disliked by women. I didn't find that really at all. I found it was like a fairly even spread, but I did find it significant that most of the top reviews were very positive and also written by men. So worth considering. I have tried to get like a smattering here just to show the range and what people are thinking. I have kind of fixed the results a little bit because I did go searching to try and find queer analysis from queer people. The first one is from user Matt Lynch, who says, instantly and persistently disorienting and gorgeous. Transmutes Stoker's syphilitic fear of female desire into a complete rejection of the rational world of men. I can be honest here because this is a safe space. When I watched this film the first time, I did fall asleep. Now, that doesn't suggest anything of the quality, but when watching it the second time for making notes, I found that the slow pace of the film, which it is very slow. This is around like a 90-minute film, but it does linger and repeat stuff quite a bit, and it is deliberate. It's trying to create like a visual aesthetic, but this kind of hypnotic and languid style feels like deliberately antithetical to a very structured, plot-heavy movie that I think is kind of the basis of the review that I just read, where in the actual story, the men in the film are peripheral and also proven to be not as rational or as important as the more manic but more coherent worlds of the women. It is weird to use the word manic and coherent as adjectives, but if you'd seen the film, you'd know that the points of identification are with the women, and as a result, we come to understand their perspectives and we see their kind of slow detachment from the men in their lives who prove to be volatile and violent and repressive, and how this is like in contrast to the slow like internal disintegration of identity that these women have to go through in order to pursue something as simple as like pleasure. It's really interesting to represent that visually with editing and like this sort of disregard for rational storytelling. This next review is from user Julia, who says, I have no idea what just happened, but I sure as hell would let that Mrs. Dracula bite me. There is such a vast difference, like generationally, to like the response to the lesbian vampire, I think. So when I was looking for research for this film, I obviously stumbled upon like books and articles from second wave feminists who are doing like film analysis on lesbianism and vampirism and how they overlap and what that kind of suggests, and how that's kind of a departure from the modern-ish, we'll say modern-ish, sensibility to watch films like this and be like, well, biting people is fun. Biting people is fun, and having sex with women is fun, so what's the issue? So I think there has to be some acknowledgement that this was made to provoke and to somewhat titillate a mostly straight audience, but that doesn't mean that our analytical brain has to stop, and it doesn't mean that our emotional reaction to seeing queer women fight and be drawn to one another and have that like analog of queerness be so like emotionally volatile and interesting, that doesn't stop us with identifying with it. Even if we choose to analyze a film in terms of how it is homophobic, and I am going to, I don't want to disregard the fact that Nadine Carady is an interesting character who does somewhat depart from other lesbian vampires in that she, in a sense, is presented as a viable option, especially when all of the men in the film lose their minds and go nuts. Time has been good to the lesbian vampire trope, which is not to say it can't be done poorly. If you put a hot woman in some people's eyeline and are like, she is going to live forever and she wants to drink your blood and also is obsessed with you and wants to make you a vampire as well, you're not going to get all rejections, are you? Okay, last one. This is from user Mallory Edwards, who says, full disclosure, the version I saw did not have English subtitles, but I think we can all agree that lesbian vampirism is a universal language. So I put this in because it's funny, but also because I think there are a few films that I can think of, and it's kind of weird because I was kind of thinking about it today, that there are a few films that are so like visually beautiful and insane to look at that you could, if you really wanted to, put them on in the background, mute them, and just have them play. Like if you were throwing like a Halloween party and you wanted something visual on the TV, you could put this on and it wouldn't disrupt. There is a lot to be said about the fact that film is a visual medium and that the several layers of language ambiguity that this film goes through anyway proves that you could very much get a lot from this film just by watching it. I wouldn't say that the dialogue or the performances are especially great. I don't think I'd be insulting anyone because I'm pretty sure everyone who made this film is now dead, is attempting to attract your attention by using visual metaphor, like different animals, like a prolonged striptease, like a kite flying in the sky. It is entirely possible to get something from this film just from watching it, which is what we do to any film, really, because film is a visual medium. I'm gonna give a spoiler warning because I've talked enough shit. Let's actually talk about the plot. Let's do some analysis. So from this point on, I will be talking about specific plot points, spoiling all sorts. There is a large chance that if you've watched any kind of Dracula adaptation or you've read the book of Dracula, then you know where this is going. Same could be true for the book Carmilla as well. If you still feel like it would ruin your experience to listen to this before watching the film, then you can go and watch the film and then come back and we can discuss lesbians together. Let's do that. It is everyone's favourite part of the podcast, mine included, where I give you a history lesson. We need to understand a little bit the context of the female vampire, and especially the lesbian vampire. For some reason, I really struggle to structure these historical bits because I do want to give context, but at the same time, flicking back and forth between sources is annoying and disruptive to the flow of what I'm trying to say. Because I want this part to be fun, and I know history isn't fun for everyone. What I typically do is I'm just going to read bullet points of historical points that I want to cover, and all of my sources are going to be in the description, and I'm going to do it that way. Please know that I haven't found any of this information myself. I've researched through other people, and they have researched from other people, and we're all looking for the one true source of information. And maybe that's what God is. Okay, I'm veering off track. Please ignore me. Anyway, the first thing I want to discuss is the poem Christabel by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So it is a poem about a vampire pursuing a young woman. And it's a story-based poem. If you've ever read those, you will have done analysis on them in secondary school, probably. But it was a poem where audiences had theorized that the vampire, Geraldine, was attempting to lure Christabel in using her secret vampire powers. And there were theories that this vampire may secretly be a man masquerading as a woman. Already, we're hitting the themes of this podcast where queerness as a concept has mostly had negative connotations to it. Specifically as like a way to describe someone as strange and weird. But the side of this that is more insidious is that queerness, and in this context, lesbianism, as a predatory force. And in this context, we're even kind of evoking transphobia as well. But what we can glean from this is that the lesbian vampire has qualities that would typically be desired in men. And when they manifest in women, this is inherently queer or negative and predatory. A second significant text that I have mentioned a couple of times is Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1871 Gothic novella, Carmilla. This is a book that predates Dracula. Every single source that mentioned this novel also mentioned that it predates Dracula. That is one of the first things you're going to hear if you ever look this up, is a vampire novel about a lesbian vampire that predates the novel of Dracula, which is a novel that has kind of come to symbolize vampirism in fiction, right? It's one that's more cited than Carmilla. As someone who is currently reading Dracula, I would say that Dracula is also a queer novel. I will argue this, not here because I don't really have time, is not without its queerness. Carmilla was seen very much transgressive in terms of the representations of gender and sexuality, and especially how being dead gave her this kind of freedom to move around the world. In the ways that women are kind of confined to specific spaces, being dead kind of removes you from the constraints of patriarchy and heteronormativity, because you don't have a reputation to take care of anymore because it died when you died. Why lesbians? The question we should be asking is, why not lesbians? I'll pause for applause. Thank you. Historically, women have been seen as kind of sexless, which is ironic because they are also incredibly sexualized, and that's going to come up quite a bit. There is a kind of perceived toothlessness to women fucking each other, and as a result, there's been this kind of lax attitude to representations of it. I think and I'm going to speak in kind of gender binary terms here, where men's sexuality is perceived as predatory, I think women's sexuality is perceived as very passive. So when approaching a scenario where you want to present something very sexualized, we're going to get more lesbian sex scenes as a result. Hammer Studios screenwriter Tudor Gates has claimed that they used lesbian storylines as a tactic against the British Board of Film Censors. Graphic sexual imagery was considered more acceptable within the supernatural, therefore more likely to slip past the censors. You have all of these prejudices stacked up on top of each other. So you've got women are hollow on the inside and incapable of experiencing sexual desire. However, we are going to sexualize them and use them as pawns to slip past the censors. So women getting murdered in horror films and women fucking each other in horror films, they kind of coalesce in this beautiful soup of the woman as object rather than person, because there is a certain order of how women are supposed to perform in movies. This also kind of overlaps with the homophobia, where of course we can show women fucking and we can show women getting murdered, and these kind of crossover in that we can exploit lesbian identity and also kill them off at the end to prove that queerness is bad, being gay is bad, and when you're a woman, you must return to the natural, quote unquote, natural order of things if you want to continue to live in this world. As Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock puts it in his book, The Vampire Film Undead Cinema, the lesbian vampire film is a voyeuristic spectacle structured for the heterosexual male gaze and connects perverse sexuality with vampirism. And that is true, isn't it? We're all freaks who want to bite people and infect everyone and turn everyone gay. With that context, let's discuss the film. Considering what we know about vampires and what they kind of represent, we come to understand Nadine, the Countess, as a character not only transgressing the stereotypes of womanhood through her vampirism, but in a sense transgressing the tropes of vampirism themselves. One of the first things we see is that she can just go out in the sun, like no problem. Nadine and Linda have a fun beach adventure where they skinny dip and lie in the sand, and Nadine's fine. Like, she's fine. She can just go out in the sun and nothing matters. What we know about her is that she has been alive for quite a while. She has the power to communicate with people psychically. She drinks blood. She can appear in mirrors. That's actually one of the first things we see, is that she's doing a show at the beginning and she's looking at herself in the mirror. I feel like that this film is very conscious that you know what to expect from a vampire, and it's going to be like, no, actually, because this woman is able to move through all kinds of spaces and is more immersed in humanity than other vampires you might know of. So in one sense, it could be, this is what makes her more scary. She just looks like a very hot human woman, and you wouldn't know her from anyone else. But I also think that this is what helps retain some of her humanity. Like I said, I've been reading the Dracula novel, and the way that the Count is described in that book is he very much struggles to blend in with other humans because he's very pale and he has red eyes and he's got these massive long nails, and he is very off-putting to look at. When you look at him, you can tell that he is not a human. Whereas here, she just looks like a relatively normal woman, which grounds her in a kind of emotional reality where we're able to more identify with her than, I'd say, not even just other vampires, like other women in other stories in the horror genre. We also know that she can only be killed by an axe to the head or being stabbed in the eye. So you can very much treat this as Franco being like, I want to create my own stuff. I want to like make up my own rules because I know that there are rules, but I want to do my own stuff. I don't want to do the stakes through the heart or the crosses. I don't want any churches. I don't want it to be dark. I don't want holy water, and I don't want a lack of reflection. I want my own stuff. This maneuver, moving the death more to the head rather than the heart, it makes the act of murder, of killing this vampire, which obviously does happen at the end, far more intimate. I think you think it'd be more antithetical for intimacy because you're stabbing someone literally through the heart. That's one of the most intimate organs there is. Having to look at someone in the face and then stab them through the eye, which is something that Linda does whilst biting Nadine's neck, is kind of more gruesome and upsetting. For me, at least, shows a very brutal moment of intimacy between these two characters. I would like to read something from Saza Hinton's article, Biting Back at Society, the Menace of the 1970s Lesbian Vampire. When representing lesbian romance within the vampire film, supernatural elements are expected to make an appearance as justification for why a woman would want to be with another woman as opposed to a man, be it hypnosis, paralysis, compulsion, or any other form of violent supernatural force. This is what is supposed to draw in the female victim. I'm just going to read another excerpt, this time from Andrea Weiss's book, Vampires and Violets, Lesbians in Film. The archetypal lesbian vampire rose to prominence at the exact point in time when the concept of lesbian identity was first coming into widespread public discourse, namely the early 70s. Indeed, that particular image of the lesbian vampire represented a displacement of anxiety over the potential for the lesbian feminist movement. With this kind of context, the idea that Linda has to be seduced into being bitten, and there's this kind of psychic connection between these two women, it represents a facet of the horror genre which I find deeply fascinating and absolutely essential, which is that the neuroses of culture, but especially of the director themselves, is what is typically driving the fears behind the film. Andrea Weiss is very apt when saying that this rising feminist movement, where the idea that women could exist on their own and not even really consider men's perspectives on their sexuality, is something that is kind of deeply upsetting when patriarchy insists a centering of those perspectives in the first place. I don't want to tread old ground, but the biting of someone's neck as a penetrative act does transgress the typical act of heterosexual sex, doesn't it? There are certain points about vampires that feel almost redundant to say because I feel like they've already been said. I do want to say it here, just in case you're not as in tune with vampire media. The act of biting being a sexual act, it does feel inherently analogous to any kind of queer sex because it's intimate, it's on the neck, and it's specifically not penis in vagina sex. So when you put this between two women, an act that is violent, that draws blood, and that is so intimate, it informs a deep-rooted fear that men's role as sexual partners could be usurped or entirely abandoned for lesbians biting each other. And instead of using this as a kind of moment of self-reflection to analyze the role of men in society in general, and if you have been told that your main role is to be a successful sexual partner, the existential anxiety that comes with analyzing what your role is now that is not the case anymore is upsetting and can be quite hard to cope with, and as a result can cause people to try to kind of by any means necessary restore the natural order, and that usually comes with intense violence and pushback from men. Now, the way that this film kind of diverts from that kind of narrative is it is Linda who is rejecting this life, and she is the one who kills Nadine, and we could perceive this as internalized misogyny, as her forcing herself into heterosexuality because she finds this desire too overwhelming and too overpowering and incredibly violent. But it is her who kind of rejects this life, and I'm gonna get onto it in the next section because I have kind of skipped ahead by accident because it kind of just came up naturally. I'm gonna walk back a little bit in the kind of representation of the lesbian vampire and how Nadine is kind of given this, I suppose, anti-men trait, which I think is meant to humanize her actions, but it kind of just reinforces the idea that lesbians are lesbians because they hate men. So we learn that Nadine was transformed into a vampire after being saved by Dracula from being raped by soldiers. This kind of traumatic event has solidified vampirism in her mind as a way to save her from suffering, and as a result, she wants to pass on this power to other women. She wants to find other women to save. Dracula tells her that he will save her from her suffering. And I think this kind of toxic and violent attitude towards processing something traumatic has become the ways that she connects with the world, by consuming and violently transforming it into something that she can control, that she can identify with. It is also interesting that the men in the film are said to be entirely incapable of vampirism, which kind of suggests to me that Jess Franco is someone who is very much aware of the transcendent power of, I guess, matriarchy. I think that's what he's getting at, where it's very much presented as a domination of the world, not just women, but men, in that women are the only ones capable of reaching this transcendent liminal state of vampirism. The role of the lesbian vampire in fiction has typically been a way of caricaturing and deconstructing the idea of the sexual woman and what this means for the natural, quote unquote, natural order of the world. This film in particular presents a world where it is entirely possible for a woman to live a life that is not heterosexual and that is not bound by human rules. However, this is not without strife and pushback and the smidgens of internalized misogyny and the loyalty to patriarchy. The lesbian vampire in specifics is disloyal to hegemony, and as a result can be very terrifying for the women who are pursued by it. And I think, whilst I do agree with feminist critics who take issue with the predatory status the lesbian vampire takes on, it gets more complicated when you have a character who is so much more powerful and also rational than the human characters in the film. Because whilst I do think that this film does fall into the tropes of the lesbian vampire, it does also seek to transcend them in a way that I think a man who is trying very hard to make a feminist film but is also very horny for women is trying to do. It walks this balancing act poorly, and it shows, unfortunately. But I do think that it is still very interesting that Franco has very little respect for the men in the film and is absolutely obsessed with the women in it. And it's not always progressive, but it is always interesting to kind of sit down and look at, which is something that I found across the films that I've watched from him, which is that he's very clearly turned on by sexy women. I mean, who isn't? And he is also interested in the ways that they are violent, angry, overly sexual, predatory, domineering, and erratic. I also don't believe that he looks down on these characters with these traits. I believe that he holds a lot of respect for them in his own way. I don't feel like he's a director who's ever able to transcend the male gaze, really. But he is interested in very specific transgressive themes, and these don't always come across in the most articulate ways, but they are incredibly interesting when you look at solidified tropes such as women as vampires, women as lesbians as vampires, and the ways that a lot of the time they aren't central characters, and we don't always come to understand what it is that they are doing right. And obviously it is subjective the way you respond to a movie. Like I was saying earlier, the lesbian vampire is a very popular character for a reason, and that isn't really any different for this film. A lot of the reviews were very supportive of Nadine. I'm sure she'd be thrilled to know, and were actively eager for her to win. And there's this understanding that within the context of the film, it kind of isn't possible for her to win. The world of the film is too human, and I think Franco looks at this fact with disdain. What I'd like to talk about next is sex, because there's quite a bit of it in this film. And I think discussing this period of time and also gender politics would be interesting and also kind of inform why sex is so explicit in this film and why Franco is as interested in it as he is. In his book, Perverse, Titillation, the Exploitation Cinema of Italy, Spain and France, 1960 to 1980, Danny Shipka argues that the time period between 1960 and 1980 was one of great social change in and around Europe. Many of these social changes were reflected in the changes of censorship standards that had governed the film industry for decades. Movies came to rely on shocking and titillating audiences with as much nudity and violence as they could handle. And if we look at Franco specifically, it's going to get a bit confusing, but Jess Franco grew up in fascist Spain under Franco, and as a result, becoming increasingly frustrated with the censorship in Spain when he was trying to get movies made, he ventured outside, which is the main reason why this film is funded by Germany, despite the fact that Jess Franco is a Spanish director. I think Europe very much came to symbolize this kind of like freedom of expression and also like a place for high art. I think particularly Americans, but the British are guilty of this as well. Europe kind of is condensed into one giant blob, and despite the cultural differences between the different countries there is this idea that they are more forward thinking and more free to explore taboo themes. The stereotype of German pornography being more extreme than that of other countries kind of comes from the fact that hardcore pornography was very kind of new and kind of popular in Germany around this time. It's when it started to really take off. I think the fact that you have European directors like moving throughout Europe does intentionally or unintentionally cause us to condense these countries into one continent and turn them into one entity, which unfortunately I don't think this film specifically seeks to refute, because as I said at the beginning, this is a Spanish director working with actors of different nationalities, all speaking their own language. It's funded by Germany and it's shot in Turkey. So we're really all over the place. But it is interesting to note that the Spanish version of this film, because it does exist, there is a Spanish dub of this film, it's longer and more heavily censored, which is unsurprising because the censorship was the specific reason that Franco didn't want to make films in Spain anymore. I read a couple of interviews and I listened to some other people's podcasts where they kind of corroborated that he was very disillusioned with the way he'd been treated by the Spanish film industry, and as a result sought to make films elsewhere. In the book The Many Faces of Jess Franco, Antonio Lazaro-Reboll and Ian Olney argue that Franco's work exists as a series of contradictions. His movies seem to be the product of a marginalized artist and a commercial hack, a horror specialist and a genre agnostic, a Spanish nationalist and a rootless exile, a feminist eroticist and a misogynistic pornographer, a relic of the grindhouse era and an apostle of the digital age. His is a cinema in which plot takes a backseat to elaborately choreographed scenes of sex and violence, designed to engage the audience at a visceral level. Franco's narratives are further decentered by their predilection for excess in the form of story elements with little or no connection to the main plot, episodic and digressive. They have an improvisational feel, a jazz-like spontaneity. And I think it's a good place to kind of start talking about form in relation to sex, because many of the scenes in this film are implied to be dreams, and we sometimes don't know when we're in a dream or when we're not in a dream. So, for example, the film begins with an extended striptease where Nadine is doing this very robotic but still kind of sensual dance where she's holding a candelabra and she's looking at herself in the mirror. She then turns around to see a quote-unquote mannequin, a completely nude woman, and this dance involves her taking off all her clothes and putting them on the mannequin, and then the two of them kind of embracing with the implication that they're going to have sex. Throughout this, we are being shown that Linda is watching this performance, and then we cut to Linda waking up in bed. So it both is and isn't implied to be a dream, but potentially something that they actually went to go see. We're never really given the explicit lines between dream and reality. There is this through line of emotionality where our experience of the film entirely hinges on Linda, her perspective on reality, and her kind of point of view with regards to her own reaction to sex and her sexuality. As a joke in the script, I put the subtitle for this section, "Women who have sex scare me," and then in brackets, "I'm a woman." It's this kind of internalized misogyny where Linda is deeply intrigued by Nadine and aroused by her, wants to have sex with her, wants to pursue something more than she's able to articulate. And this seeps into her unconscious mind, but it also haunts her waking life as well. And this kind of repression, being forced out of her mind into the real world, is what is terrifying to her. And as a result, the film, the intense kind of misogyny of the characters, especially, I want to say Dr. Seward, who is kind of also obsessed with Nadine, but is more forthright and actively wants to be a vampire. We could argue that the film is simply Linda's perception, where Nadine is an extension of her queerness, and the idea that someone could live in the way that she does, be so effortlessly confident and horny, is absolutely terrifying, and as a result, she has to be the one to quell it and return things to an even keel, even if it means embracing a misogynistic world. This is not to say that Linda is not tempted by this world. One of the first things that she does when she meets Nadine for the first time is she takes her up on her offer to go skinny dipping, and they have a fun beach day where they get completely naked and they splash about in the sea and then they lie down on the sand. I don't love this scene mainly because all I'm imagining is sand absolutely everywhere, and I hate I hate sand. It's so whimsical. I don't know how to explain it, but so many of Franco's films just get very very silly, usually for a short period of time, but there will be the odd scenes that are just really they feel out of place. And I'd argue that in terms of tone, this scene feels out of place, but if we're thinking thematically, it's meant to show to us that this relationship between these two women feels very natural, as though they've already met before. The niceties that are needed to grease the wheels of social awkwardness between two regular people just don't exist. Nadine immediately puts Linda at ease, and as a result, she is able to get completely naked within like 5 minutes of meeting her, and they behave as though they have known each other for a very long time. What we're dealing with in terms of representations of sex in the film is, I think, a very heterosexual and patriarchal idea that if Linda were to succumb to her desires, it would mean a kind of subjugation. And we see this in the character of Agra, who has kind of been driven insane by her desire and the control that Nadine has over her. So Agra is a previous lover of Nadine who's been trapped in Dr. Seward's home for treatment, quote unquote. And it's this idea that when a woman has sex, right, typically with a man, there is this like loss of innocence in the concept of virginity. This is sex that can only happen once for the first time. And I think I talked in the previous section about the kind of masculinizing of the female vampire. I'd say that the idea that being with this other woman who is a vampire and who is able to exert such control over these women's lives mirrors the submission that is expected of women when entering into romantic and sexual relationships with men. That it signifies a loss of identity and of freedom, that Linda would be held captive by her sexual desires. The fact that she is already having dreams where she says that she has reached orgasm in her sleep due to the dreams that she's having. So there's this fear that pursuing this relationship would cause her to no longer be herself in the way that we're meant to believe Agra is no longer herself. Now, this entirely ignores the fact that Dr. Seward is keeping Agra captive in his home for the sake of treatment. So it's this kind of ironic self-sabotage where Linda works so hard to not belong to Nadine, to be free from her control because she wants her identity and she doesn't want to be subjugated. However, she is entirely blind / complicit with the patriarchal system that she is like flinging herself into as a result of murdering Nadine and quote unquote freeing herself from her control, because she walks right into her boyfriend's arms and Agra is still trapped with Dr. Seward. This is not a system where she would have won, quote unquote. It's this kind of idea that her killing the queer part of her will allow her to conform a lot easier. But I think it does also mirror the kind of lack of self-awareness that comes with staying with a boyfriend who doesn't make you happy because you feel it's what is expected of you. You know, the more I think about it, the more sad this ending makes me, because patriarchy wins. And I think Franco is at least somewhat conscious of this fact, that this psychic connection between all three of these women is somewhat horrifying, definitely, but it's also special and kind of transcendent, and I think more importantly for the film, exclusionary, because it only exists between the women. And I think the anxiety of potentially not having this system of power in place, even if it's harming you, can be absolutely terrifying. I think you find a lot of conservatives often kind of mirror this idea where they are furious at the system that's in place. They seem like perpetually angry that things are terrible, but will do everything in their power to make sure that the system is functioning, that it continues to function, even if it's terrible and causes them harm. And I think Linda killing Nadine as a way of repressing her own sexuality becomes this deeply tragic thing where I think it's an understandable choice, but it honestly makes me really sad to think that this woman believes that the only way she'll be able to live a good life is by not pursuing bodily desires or queerness, and that being with her boyfriend who just doesn't really enlighten anything in her, it makes me really sad. I spoke a little bit about psychic connections and also systems of power. I would specifically like to talk about control because it plays a massive part of this film. I've already discussed the opening striptease in relation to repressed sexuality, but I would also like to discuss it in relation to performance and how it kind of portrays the system of power. The performance at the beginning of the film very much lays out the entire characterization of Nadine as a vampire. In this performance, she kind of displays the way that women relate to each other, both as sexual objects and as people. Nadine taking off her clothes and then putting them on this mannequin does, in a sense, display a kind of solidarity amongst those who are often objectified. There's this kind of push and pull of agency and subjugation happening at the same time. It also, just on like a kind of basic level, displays that she wants someone to share her life with. There's this kind of fantasy of her being responsible for creating someone else's womanhood and transforming that person into a creature of evil and the power that this would hold over that person. We see that Nadine is capable of talking to her subjects psychically. So she's constantly calling to Linda throughout. We see this kind of visualized by a kite like wafting through the sky. So it will be like a succession of images where it's Nadine's face, then this kite, then whatever Linda's doing. And at the end of the film, the kite kind of crashes to the ground. I'm not going to say Franco is a subtle director, but he is one that is deeply symbolic. And I think this kind of idea of thoughts traveling through the air and Nadine not even having to be in the room with Linda to have control over her. If we are to argue that Nadine is a personification of Linda's queerness, then it becomes a kind of haunting, all-encompassing scream into the void where it's entirely unavoidable and referring to her by name. We kind of see this in Agra as well, who went through the same thing, who still kind of hears and feels Nadine because she states that she was me and I was her. So vampirism, as an analogue for lesbianism, argues that it is Nadine's desire to subsume this human in order to sustain herself. That is not simply a partnership, but it is a consumption, that she would take Linda's identity and, discard her in the way that she did with Agra. And I am kind of fascinated by the idea that it is not simply Linda who is forced into this power struggle, because Nadine is as trapped by her desire for Linda as Linda is trapped by her desire for Nadine. So in spite of the fact that she is meant to be this otherworldly being who is quite powerful, she is entirely at the mercy of her own compulsion to kill and eat people. I do really enjoy the way that it kind of blurs the lines between predator and victim, especially in the end when Linda is the one to bite Nadine. So earlier in the episode, I kind of talked about how I used the quote from The Many Faces of Jess Franco to talk about how his films are episodic and will go off on tangents, which is not dissimilar to the actual book Dracula, where you're hearing from all these different perspectives. There are these kind of branching subplots, and I'm going to talk about them separately. I think we should talk about Dr. Seward, because I've already mentioned him a few times. He is a character who is significant because he is a doctor who is aware of vampirism and is trying to treat Agra of her obsessive mental instability. He ends up also taking in Linda to his private clinic. But I really enjoyed that instead of presenting him as a rational, reasonable and kind-hearted doctor like Dr. Seward is in the original novel, Franco chooses to present him as this obsessive weirdo who is as obsessed with vampirism as Nadine is, as Linda is, as Agra is, that him trapping these various women in his clinic under the guise of medical care is no different really to Nadine. And this is paralleled also in the character of Mehmet, who is played by none other than Jess Franco. I'm not going to beat around the bush. He is a serial killer who captures women and then tortures and kills them. These two characters are essentially the same character because they seek to punish the women who have experienced these supernatural powers that they would never have access to. And he even says, "In death, you'll kiss me and tell me you can't live without me." What we have are a series of characters trying to maintain control in a world that is increasingly trying to take control from them. And as a result, they are left with no option but to violently attack that which is the source of their obsession. So Dr. Seward traps Agra and Linda in his clinic as a way to capture the residue of vampirism that he cannot have access to. Mehmet traps and kills women as a way of punishing Agra, his wife who is driven to obsession, for leaving him for a vampire. Nadine attempts to keep Linda under her spell with the intent of turning her into a vampire, and Linda is forced to kill Nadine as a way of getting out from under her thumb. None of these characters get to live a life where they are free from desire, but they all have to enact some kind of violence to stave off the manipulative force that is holding them captive. Does this film look like a badger? As I said, I nearly fell asleep twice during it. I have no idea whether this is a me problem or if it's simply because Franco's films are weirdly paced and tonally all over the place. I feel as though they are often being stretched to meet runtime requirements. There will often be repeated scenes, and I think we can stretch ourselves to analyze them to mean something more than they do, but sometimes I think it is simply the fact that he wanted a movie that was nearly 90 minutes and they didn't have enough film, so they just stretched it out. I find his relationship to sex fascinating, as I've talked about, but I also want to acknowledge that many of his incentives for putting sex in his film are to simply show off how hot his wife is, which I do respect in some ways. and maybe kind of disliking others. I didn't really read enough of a biography of Franco to know if he was a creep or not. And from the podcast I listened to, it didn't really seem like anyone had anything that unsavory to say about him. But I don't know. Whenever someone's career is entirely shooting naked women, I do get a bit suspicious at times. I don't really have a reason to, or at least I haven't found one, so I'm not going to imply anything here. I can't say that I was that blown away by much of the actual film. I think I've seen better examples of lesbian vampire films that I've just enjoyed more. Can't say the ideas about power and gender weren't interesting at all either. I'm going to do quick fire recommendations because my brain is melting out of my head, so I'm just going to get them out of the way. Female Vampire is another Jess Franco film about his second wife. She goes around masturbating and biting people. The Velvet Vampire, a dark-haired bisexual vampire, is trying to fuck your boyfriend. And Daughters of Darkness, one of the first 70s lesbian vampire movies I watched, and one I should probably revisit because I remember it being very artful and quite transgressive as well. Thank you very much for listening. I will be back shortly. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter at LikeABadgerPod. Follow on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you would like to read my new poetry chapbook, Internet Brain Rot, I will leave a link in the description along with a link to my other writing. All of my sources are in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you have a good Halloween. And I'll see you next time. Bye!